What would you do if one day your loved one, a famous prosecutor, suddenly disappeared without a trace? No accident, no goodbye, just an open laptop with a strange message. If I disappear, don't look for me. Find the truth. This is not a movie. It is a series of real events triggered by a 64-year-old woman named Renata Vaughn, who dared to challenge a secret surveillance system called Tier 12, which has been silently classifying tens of thousands of American citizens without anyone knowing. On this journey, you will discover never-before-seen secrets, breathtaking confrontations between conscience and power, and a disappearance that changed America. If you believe that the truth never dies, stay until the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following stories that can give you goosebumps, because they are not just stories. They are wake-up calls. The Capitol was as usual. Solemn cold closed behind bulletproof glass and invisible barriers of power. Everyone knew this was no place for emotion. Here, anger was tempered with metaphor, pain was presented with statistics, and justice, when it existed, was often dressed in formal shirts. Renata Vaughn, a U.S. Senator from Georgia, entered with her usual steady stride. She wore a dark blue suit and a small magnolia pin on her breast, a small but unmistakable personal detail. Everyone there knew the flower was her personal symbol, not only because it was the national flower of Georgia, but because her younger brother had drawn it for her on his last birthday before he died. Renata was not tall, nor did she speak loudly, but her presence always commanded attention. Not because she was the only woman of color sitting on the special committee that day, but because her calm demeanor was what made the yellers feel awkward. They couldn't drag her into the arena of arguments. She fought not with heated words, but with eyes that made others look at themselves. The hearing was held amid a heavy atmosphere. Local newspapers had just exposed the Baldwin County Sheriff's Department's use of AI to fabricate profiles of suspects, most of whom coincidentally were black. The county mayor was facing prosecution. An internal watchdog unit had been shut down, and most notably, a 17-year-old boy. Tyrese Quinn had been wrongly imprisoned for 11 months because of a flawed algorithm without a trial. Renata asked to question the director of Federal Judicial Security, Boyd Caldwell. A large white man with reddish-brown hair, a heavy badge on his lapel. He had long been considered a man with deep ties to many conservative states. In his eyes, unrest only occurred when poor people and people of color demanded the right to breathe. Director Caldwell, Renata said, her voice as light as a breeze. Can you explain why a boy with no criminal record, just because his face was 78% similar to a computer image, was arrested without a warrant, without a lawyer, and held in custody for almost a year? Caldwell did not answer immediately. He blinked, leaned toward the microphone, and looked at Renata with a look that was half mockery, half contempt. I don't think you understand the technicalities of the analytical model, he replied. But if you want to clarify, I can suggest inviting an AI expert to give a lecture. Provided, he smirked, that person isn't a politician who just uses emotional language to buy votes. The room fell silent. Everyone waited for Renata to respond. A young female MP sitting behind her clenched her fists. But Renata's expression didn't change. She just tilted her head slightly, as if listening for something deeper than the semantics of the answer. Thank you, she said calmly. I'll take that into account. But I don't need an expert to know that a child being wrongly imprisoned without accountability is a real mistake. And I don't need AI to prove it. The air in the room fell. Everyone's eyes began to turn toward Caldwell. No longer the consensus they had at first. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. Mr. Caldwell. Instead of maintaining his professional demeanor as prescribed, suddenly stood up. In a swift, strong, and violent gesture, he swung his arm, and slapped Renata Vaughn square in the face. The slap was not loud, but in the absolute silence of the chamber, it echoed like a gunshot. A female assistant behind her dropped her briefcase. A cameraman missed the beat, too stunned to press the shutter. Renata stopped. She didn't fall. She didn't scream. She didn't hold her cheek. She just stood there, like a statue made of stone, her eyes wide open, not in pain but in disbelief. In that moment, the entire nation held its breath. No one could have imagined such an act could happen. In the middle of the parliament, in front of television cameras, in front of millions of people. And the most astonishing thing of all, she didn't protest. She didn't call security. She didn't question. She didn't cry. She just turned around and walked away from the podium as if she were the one at fault. No one said anything. No one dared. The media was immediately banned from recording the rest of the clip. The clip stopped 42 seconds after the slap, and then cut to the Parliament logo. But that short clip, less than a minute long, was shared like crazy. On social media, it had no other title than "The Slap of Power." And that woman, who did not cry, did not speak up, did not fight back, became the center of attention. People shared the video not because of Caldwell's actions, but because of the way Renata did not react. No one understood that. Some thought she was afraid. Some said she was planning something. But there was a group of people, those who had been insulted, beaten, and could not fight back. They understood. Because they had lived in silence, they had stood in the middle of a crowd, insulted by words, by actions, by attitudes, without being allowed to fight back. Because if they reacted, they would be labeled as extremist. If they fought back, they would be called dangerous. If they cried, they were weak. If they remained silent, they were considered cowards. But when they saw Renata Vaughn, the congresswoman, the powerful, the intelligent, the unquestioned, they saw themselves. That slap was not meant for a woman. It was meant for a whole community. It was an undeniable symbol of arrogance, of subtle violence disguised as power. But her reaction, her cool composure, was a wordless declaration of war. And so the wave began. Not from the capital, but from the slums, from the small churches, from the university campuses, from the hospitals, from the bus stops, where people still live with the feeling of being slapped every day. They saw themselves in Renata's image, and they began to ask, if a congresswoman can be slapped in public like that, where are we safe? If she doesn't say anything, should we speak for her? Or is it that silence is the loudest voice? After the national slap, Renata Vaughn did not appear in public for 3 days. No press releases, no live streams of rebuttals, no demands for disciplinary action. She did not return to her main home in Atlanta. She left as silently as a water shadow, slipping from the palm of a hand. Those closest to her did not know where she was. Until a young female assistant, after dozens of unanswered calls, received a text message from an unknown number, just 12 words. "Don't worry, I'm home. Need to hear the sound of the earth again." And it was true. Renata was in Montesille, a little-known town nestled in the barren plains of southern Georgia, where she was born in a plywood house without air conditioning, where she lived through 40-degree summers with a hand fan and stories told by kerosene lamp. There the sky seemed wider. The earth seemed to crack open with memories. The old oak tree at the head of the field behind her house still stood tall, carrying the old rope. From when her ancestors were chained, Renata had not come to hide. She had come back to remember. As she stepped onto the rotten wooden steps leading to the old house, she took off her shoes. Her bare feet touched the ground. A small act, but one that carried a sacred weight. For Renata was not just returning to her birthplace. She was stepping onto the land of her ancestors, a place that had been trampled, burned, and forgotten, but still alive. There was not much in the house, just 4 small rooms, the walls mottled with patches of sun and rain. But in that dilapidated kitchen, her mother had stood all day just to cook a pot of black beans. In the living room, with only rattan chairs and a rickety wooden table, her father had sat reading aloud from the Word of God, his hand on her forehead, praying that her daughter would be strong like Esther and forgiving like Joseph. Renata grew up with two things: wounds and prayers. Her father, Reverend Vaughn, was the first to teach her the power of silence, not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of swallowing fire. "You don't have to shout for everyone to hear," he once said. "You just have to live until they listen." When she was 10, her younger brother Elijah died after a chase with the police. They said he looked like a wanted suspect. They said he ran away, so they had to shoot him. They said it was an occupational hazard. Elijah was 12, and he was just holding a comic book running to buy a soda for his sister. Renata doesn't remember crying when she heard the news. She just stood there frozen in the doorway, her whole body cold. Her mother collapsed in the room, her father quietly opening the Bible. His hands shaking, read a passage that she remembers to this day. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew chapter 5:10. Renata didn't believe it at the time. A storm was raging inside that child, but from those ashes, a silent promise was formed in her heart. No more children like Elijah would die in vain. Even though she didn't know how, even though that path hurt her. Years later, when Renata became a law professor at Howard University and then gradually entered politics, people always wondered why she didn't argue like others. Why didn't she use the media to expose her? Why didn't she denounce her loudly? They didn't know Renata didn't choose to fight with fire, because she had lived her whole life in ashes. She chose to be silent, patient, and when necessary, to speak with razor-sharp truth. When she was slapped right in the parliament, people thought she was shocked, hurt to the point of helplessness. They were wrong. She wasn't helplessness. She was keeping her promise to Elijah, not to fight back with her fists, but to wait for the right moment. Not to give the wrongdoer a chance to play the victim. On the third evening in Montesil, she stood alone at her parents' grave. She held a candle unlit, just placed there, as a request. Then she whispered, unheard, on the ground, "Dad, Mom. Elijah didn't live to see me slapped in the face in the Capitol, but I know, if he did, he wouldn't stand by and watch, and neither would I. But I won't retaliate. I'll respond in a different way, with truth, with revelation, with what they took. I'll get back." In that moment, Renata was no longer a congresswoman, no longer a representative of Georgia. She was a sister, a daughter, a child who had lost so much and still stood strong. And in her heart, a fire was lit again. No longer a numbing pain, but a sacred commitment. She would return not to defend her own honor, but to demand justice for all those who had no chance to speak. When Rep. Renata Vaughn returned to Capitol Hill on Monday morning, no one noticed anything out of the ordinary. She was still wearing a neat, dark linen coat with a high collar and no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back into a bun. Her eyes behind her thin glasses were as usual, calm, reserved, even weary. But only those who had faced her in debate knew one thing: when Renata is silent for too long, a storm is brewing. Across the hall, the building's security chief, Charles Maddox, who had just slapped her in front of dozens of witnesses, had not been suspended. He was allowed to continue working, pending an internal investigation. A 6-word phrase that has covered hundreds of cases of wrongdoing throughout the Capitol's history. As with previous incidents, the media reported the story for 3 days. The internet was outraged, the hashtags went viral, and then everything was buried under a storm of new news. But what Maddox didn't know, and what the system didn't know, was this: Renata Vaughn wasn't here to scream. She was here to clean up, from the ground up. In a small office with not a single picture on the wall, Renata called a secret internal meeting. No one on the team knew what was about to happen. Not the communications manager, not the general counsel, not her longtime assistant. On the screen, she projected a diagram of the internal structure of the Department of Congressional Security. She pointed to Charles Maddox, and then quietly clicked. Arrows began to appear where the budget was coming from. What contracts had been signed in the past 2 years? Who was the policy sponsor for the security department? What private company provided tactical training for people like Maddox? "We're not prosecuting a man," Renata said, her voice soft, but as solid as granite. "We're exposing a whole chain of interests that allowed him to think that slapping a black woman in the middle of the floor would be something that could be forgotten." One of the group worried, "But if we go public, they'll fight back with smears fabrications." Renata raised her head, her eyes shining like 2 blades sharpened in the winter sun. "Yes. And that's why we're not going public, not yet. Before they know what we're exposing, we'll know everything they're hiding." She wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a law professor, specializing in power structures and hidden legalities. Renata knew how to read what others missed, the little clauses in security contracts, the irregular expense reports, the internal memos sent by mistake to the wrong person. And most importantly, she had students everywhere. She gathered the pieces from former students who were working in prosecutors' offices' audits and even the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Each report, each seemingly meaningless phone call, she pieced together like a map of guilt. 3 days later, her team made a horrifying discovery. The private company that provided specialized training for congressional security staff, where Maddox had worked before his appointment, had been sued for allegedly discriminating based on racial characteristics. The lawsuit was settled out of court, sealed by a confidentiality agreement. Worse yet, among the company's executives was a former federal judge who now serves as special counsel to the very same Congressional Ethics Committee. And the most shocking thing, a young white Idaho congressman once considered to be Maddox's mentor to his current position received more than $300,000 in campaign contributions from an organization that defends American security traditions, which Renata's team later identified as a money laundering fund for that very company. It was a web of power where slaps were just the outward manifestation of a long-standing system that was immune to accountability, a system that believed it could stifle any voice that wasn't its own. Renata knew if she spoke up early, they would fabricate false evidence, create a personal scandal, label her a professional victim, a racially motivated rabble-rouser. They had done it to dozens of others. She wouldn't let them do it to her. Not again. And then one Friday morning, she sent an internal email to the entire ethics committee with a short subject line: "Request for an independent Section 14. Investigation. Inappropriate financial interest in a national security appointment." In the email, she didn't mention the slap. She didn't use the word discrimination. She didn't mention Charles Maddox by name. But she attached a 147-page PDF. These included shady training contracts, irregular funding statements, cash flow diagrams, anonymous witnesses, and training records that showed signs of irregularities. All were legal. All were unforgivable. And all were sent simultaneously to 3 major news organizations, as well as an investigator from the Office of the Inspector General of Congress, who had once been her close protege. Less than 24 hours later, the press exploded. But this time, no one called her a victim. They called her a whistleblower. A silent warrior, the woman who made the entire Congress face what they had always avoided. Charles Maddox, from a brazen slapper on the floor of the House, was now a small link in a chain of national wrongdoing. And when the press hounded Renata for interviews, she appeared only once, in a brief 3-minute press conference, saying only one sentence: "I am not taking revenge. I am doing what the system promised, but never did cleaning itself up." When the first reports broke, Renata Vaughn knew she had exactly 36 hours before those threatened by the leaks would strike back. They didn't need much time. With the money connections and influence they had, A day and a half was enough to craft an elaborate counter-narrative, and sometimes a cleverly disguised accident. But she had been prepared for that. The entire original investigative file had been encrypted and sent to 3 international human rights organizations, one of which had helped expose a torture ring overseas. Another copy was in the hands of Amaya, her closest aide, and the only person Renata had ever trusted implicitly after her husband's death. Amaya knew that if she could not reach him within 24 hours, a series of emails containing evidence would be sent automatically to 3 independent investigative reporters and several opposition members who did not love Renata, but would not miss the opportunity to attack the current system. "I don't need them to love me," Renata once told Amaya. "I just need them to hate the same thing I hate." But what she did not anticipate was the speed with which the machinery of power would respond. Less than 18 hours after the email was released, Renata was called into an emergency meeting chaired by the chairman of the Ethics Committee. The meeting was labeled internal off-camera, no minutes. As soon as she stepped into the room with its heavy curtains and dim lighting, she knew this was not a place for justice to speak. This was a place where handshakes were made behind the public's backs. The first to speak was Senator Roland Greaves, 68. A mild-mannered man with a voice that could have silenced anyone in Congress. "Renata," he said, his voice laced with pity. "I understand your anger. I understand that it can be emotional. But releasing internal investigation documents without going through the proper process is process." Renata interrupted. "You mean the process that kept Charles Maddox in his position as director for 3 years after 3 anonymous complaints of abuse?" Greaves didn't answer. He just looked at her, his gaze not angry, but calculating. "We shouldn't burn down a house over a moldy wall, Miss Vaughn." "I didn't burn anything," she replied. "I'm just pointing out that there's poison gas in the walls. And if anyone's coughing because of that, maybe they should find out why they built the walls with rotten stuff." The meeting ended in a wordless tension. She left the room feeling familiar alone, just like 20 years ago, when she was the only black woman in her constitutional law class, when all eyes were on her as a test of patience. But unlike then this time, she had something she didn't have then, legitimate power and tempered anger. That night, Renata sat alone in her Georgetown apartment. The yellow light fell on the paper she was writing by hand, a habit she had kept since her teaching days. When she needed clarity, she didn't type. She wrote. Each stroke of dark blue ink was steady. Every system pretends to be great until it is exposed to light. We should not be surprised when the light makes the rats run, but we should not forget the light has to be strong. And then she wrote the names of those who had been silent for the past 3 years, those who had signed the budget, those who had refused to investigate, those who had been colleagues, friends. Renata didn't go on television. She didn't post anything on social media, but she quietly continued to release new evidence, wave after wave, to independent journalists, human rights lawyers, civil society groups. Every time they touched a piece of the truth, Maddox and his ilk lost their place. A week later, at an event at Howard University, when asked to speak to 200 law students, Renata stepped up to the podium. She didn't read a speech. She recounted the slap, but she didn't sound like a victim. "That man didn't slap me because I was a woman. He slapped me because I was something he couldn't control. A black woman, intelligent, empowered, and not afraid of him." The audience stood up and applauded. "I didn't respond with rage. I responded with truth. And if you think truth is soft, look at how it shakes the system." By this time, Renata was no longer alone. Young lawmakers, citizen groups, even former security guards, began sending her information, leaked files, internal recordings. A network of exposure began to form, with her, the slapped woman, at the center, but standing up, challenging a rampart. It started with silence, not the calm after a storm, but an eerie, cold, empty silence, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Renata Vaughn felt the change first, as she walked into her familiar office on the 12th floor of the Federal Building. A place she had once called a sanctuary of justice eyes were avoiding her that day. Colleagues who had once shaken her hand warmly now nodded, and some turned away, pretending not to see. The morning greetings faded like thin smoke, and the silence was louder than any accusation. A nameless punishment. No words, just aloofness. What was scarier was the coldness of those who had once been close. Her new assistant, a young man who had been eager to learn, now avoided her eyes. Meetings were cancelled without reason. Emails were slow to respond, sometimes not at all. Calls from partner organizations stopped abruptly, as if she had become a dangerous keyword on a government watch list. And then the first call came. One night when she was home alone, the phone rang. No number, no ID. Don't think we don't know where you live? The man's voice, deep, even unhurried, no shouting, but the certainty in each word made her shiver. The call ended immediately after that. No hang-up, just a long silence, then a dead signal. Renata was not a person to be swayed, but she was not stupid. With 25 years of experience in high-level investigations, she knew what a deliberate threat was and what came next. She changed the locks, installed security cameras, canceled all public appointments, but the unease didn't come from the outside. It came from not knowing who the real enemy was. When you're up against a system, you're not just up against a person, you're up against the shadow of power. Amaya, her loyal assistant, was the only one who kept in regular contact. But even she began to receive anonymous messages warning her to back off or risk her young career protecting a man who's about to be overthrown. One night, as Renata was returning from a closed-door meeting with investigative journalists, her car was tailed. The black sedan had no license plate. The rearview mirror showed a cold gaze through the tinted glass, as if the driver just wanted her to know he was there. Renata turned left 3 times, right twice, stopped at red lights longer than she should have, but the car kept moving steadily like darkness following light. She didn't go home that night. She drove straight to the office of an old friend, civil rights attorney, Nayla Rhodes, and slept on the office couch with a thin blanket and a folding knife tucked into her jacket sleeve. For the first time in years, Renata did not sleep deeply. She was startled by the sound of honking horns outside. Her heart raced every time her phone rang. A woman who had faced the most dangerous criminals. Now she was afraid of the sound of wind hitting the glass. The next day, a painful turning point came. Amaya was suspended. No reason was given, just an email from the Office of Personnel Management that her activities were found to violate internal confidentiality guidelines Amaya called Renata. Her voice was shaking. They came into my house. They said they were just checking my devices, but I saw them copying my personal hard drive. They asked me what my personal relationship was with you. Renata clenched her fists. She knew that Amaya was being systematically isolated just like she was, but worse. Now she was smeared, framed, and pushed out of the system from the shadows. She knew the trick: separate the supporters from the accusers, divide. Make the brave feel alone, doubt themselves, and then silence them. But Renata wouldn't be silent. She started recording every call, sending encrypted messages to reporters in case the phones were tapped. Every step she took now carried the scent of danger. Every email was sent with the same deliberation as if it were her last word. On a March morning, as gray as her heart, Renata walked into the garage to pick up her car and saw that all the tires had been slashed. A faint red mark appeared on the windshield. A bloody fingerprint. Not much, but enough to get the message across. She backed away. Her legs were shaking. In that moment, she didn't see herself as a federal prosecutor. She didn't see herself as the strong woman who had taken down 3 human trafficking organizations. She saw herself as a mother, a woman of color alone, and being hunted by the very people who were empowered to protect her. Viewers, if you've ever felt your heart sink at this point, if you've ever felt isolated for speaking your truth, you know the pain Renata is feeling. You know isolation isn't silence. It's the presence of fear in the gaps. Click like to stand with Renata, to say that you saw her. You didn't turn away. You didn't stay silent. And if you've ever wondered, can one person fight the system? Stay, because the next part will tell you. There is one thing that powerful people often forget, that a person who is pushed to the edge has nothing to lose. And when someone like Renata Vaughn has nothing to lose, that is when she becomes the most dangerous. After the night of the blood smears on the windshield, the taunting message, Renata knew they no longer wanted to intimidate her. They wanted to break her. They wanted her to give up. And if they couldn't, they would destroy everything around her until she collapsed, piece by piece. And it was true. That event was just the first spark. 3 days later, a tabloid ran a special story with the sensational headline, "Prosecutor Renata Vaughn, suspected of tampering with government database. Confidential source. She has severe psychological problems after husband's death, a wordless slap in the face to the reputation she had built over 3 decades. The truth is distorted. Trust is poisoned." Renata silently read the article. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were no longer trembling with fear. They were smoldering with anger, not just because of the blatant slander, but because of the detail they mentioned about the death of her husband, Anthony Vaughn, a firefighter who died in a fire in 2003. That was the limit. That was the line she would not allow anyone to cross. "You chose the wrong person to destroy," Renata said to herself, on a rainy afternoon when she stood in front of the wedding photo hanging in the hallway. Anthony's eyes were still as gentle as ever. The counterattack began with an old hard drive. Renata quietly opened the safe in her home office. She took out a silver portable hard drive, almost worn out, but inside it contained all the investigative data backups she had secretly collected when she detected signs of irregularities in the internal database. A redacted report has now been returned to its original form. A recording of 2 senior officers discussing silencing a female witness, a handwritten note from Renata, a conversation between a federal official and a representative from the Tier 12 data analytics system included a reference to racially biased behavioral analysis, but it was hidden from Congress. She carefully coded everything, sent it over an anonymous network to 4 independent journalists who had worked with her on previous cases. No names, no trace, just a single line. "If I can no longer speak, please speak for me. A critical incident, the cost of resistance." But just as hope was quietly raised, disaster struck like a cold knife from behind. That afternoon, while Renata was on her way to meet with civil rights attorney Nayla Rhodes to discuss filing an emergency motion in federal court, her car was hit from behind at a deserted intersection in Brookline. The impact was so hard that the car spun sideways, skidding nearly 25 feet before hitting a guardrail. The airbag deployed. The windshield shattered. She didn't lose consciousness, but blood ran from her forehead into her eyes. A brief wave of dizziness hit her. Everything was a blur for a few minutes. When the ambulance arrived, she barely managed to mumble, "It wasn't an accident. They wanted to kill me." And then, the hospital. Renata woke up in the cold, white room of the city's central hospital. Head bandaged, left arm in a cast. Sore. But her will was unshaken. Nayla came. Her eyes heavy. "I looked at the security cameras near the scene," she said softly. "The other car had no license plate. The police said the tracking system didn't record anything, and it seems they don't intend to investigate further." Renata let out a small laugh. A bitter laugh, almost choking. "They didn't have to kill me. They just had to let me know that if I continued, they would take everything I had to the grave." Fires were burning not to burn, but to illuminate. But they were wrong about one thing. No one could kill someone who had devoted her life to the truth. Renata was no ordinary woman. She embodies every mother, sister, daughter of color who has ever been silenced by the system. And she knows that pain is just fuel for the fire of determination. When she was released from the hospital, the first thing Renata did was call a press conference independent of the system. A press conference at the headquarters of the National Civil Liberties Union. 16 reporters showed up, hundreds watched live via live stream. In a weak voice but with burning eyes, Renata said, "I was stalked, threatened, and almost killed, not because I committed a crime, but because I dared to speak the truth. They can take away my reputation, my job, my life, but they can't take away this, the public awakening." After the shocking press conference, posts with the hashtag justice for Renata began spreading across social media like wildfire in a dry field. But what surprised her was not the outpouring of support from the community. It was the private messages from quiet, vulnerable people who had never spoken up. A black nurse who had been fired for reporting racial discrimination in patient care sent her a video secretly filmed in a boardroom. A 16-year-old student sent her a scan of an essay she had written about systemic bias and the pain of an unprotected child, with the words, "I didn't know who to write to, but now I'm writing to you." Renata read each line in the small living room, where all electronic devices had been removed for fear of being overheard. Each story was a stab in the heart, but also a rebirth of faith in a new form, no longer alone. At around 2 a.m., the house phone rang. A deep, slow male voice said, "If you still have a copy of the conversation last February between Inspector General Marcus Kane and the Deputy Director of Tier 12, check the recording." At the 17-minute mark, they say a name that if released, the system will no longer be able to deny. Renata remained silent. "No identification, no confirmation," the voice chuckled. "We've waited too long for someone like you. Don't let them shut you down. They've shut you down too many times." And then the call ended, as quickly as a cold wind blowing through a crack in the door. She turned back, playing the original recording. At exactly 17:23, Marcus Kane's voice said softly, "If the data on case 412, alias Santiago, is leaked, not only will we lose our control, but the Federal Commission will have to testify." Alias Santiago, the code name, a name that had never been revealed to the public. Renata understood she had just held the key to unlocking the entire door, locked by decades of manipulation. 3 days later, a national television program, backed by a pro-government media group, invited an anonymous former colleague on the air, saying sarcastically, "Renata Vaughn, a talented woman, I won't deny it, but lately she's been losing control. Her husband's death, the Tier 12 investigation. She's not herself anymore." They called her obsessed with conspiracy theories, not sane, having spent her life using reason and the law to serve the truth. She was now framed as a delusional old woman. Renata sat watching the show alone. Not a single tear fell, only her heart pounding like a drum, because she knew they were afraid, while those forces were busy covering up in another corner of the city. A fourth-year law student, named Tanya Hughes, posted a 7-minute video on TikTok. The content. She recounted the first time Renata mentored her intern, and how she defended an anonymous victim in a case that all the other prosecutors had dismissed as a small, insignificant case. "I have never seen anyone take each citizen as seriously as she does," Tanya said, her eyes lighting up. "She taught me that the law is not a tool to win, but to protect the voiceless." Within 36 hours, the video had surpassed 1 million views. Clips from Renata's press conference were added. Hashtags like, "We stand with Renata," and "Hatch no more." Silence were popping up more and more. Renata, in a rare moment between the frenzied days, looked out the window, where the late winter sun cast a shimmering light across the pavement. She knew that fighting a powerful system meant choosing a path full of thorns. But thorns could not pierce a heart hardened by hurt and steadfast in its cause. "If I must fall, I will fall on the side I have chosen," she whispered quietly. And for each person who stood by her side, from former colleagues who quietly submitted anonymous documents to students, journalists, and ordinary people, she was no longer alone. That night, Renata Vaughn sat quietly in her small living room, the ticking of the wall clock, an invisible reminder of the passing minutes. She had listened to the recording nearly 30 times, each syllable of Marcus Kane replayed and replayed, analyzed from every angle. Alias Santiago. Those two words were no longer meaningless code words. They were the key, and Renata knew that the only person who had ever mentioned that name in public without knowing how important it was a man who had mysteriously disappeared nearly a year earlier, Dr. Nolan Reese. Renata typed his name into search engines. Most of them led to dry articles. Data scientist leaves institute for personal reasons, no comment from family. Some pages had been removed, but she remembered clearly last April, just days before he disappeared. Nolan had been on a webinar where he had accidentally mentioned the name Santiago Protocol while talking about population modeling algorithms. It was something Tier 12 had used to track people of color in the name of predicting crime. She followed the trail. A small forum for cybersecurity analysts had stored the session as an MP4. Renata opened it. At exactly 38 minutes, Nolan Reese, his face still gentle, his hair a mess of gray, looked straight into the camera and said, "I can't confirm, but if there is a system based on the so-called Santiago Protocol, then we're looking at something that goes beyond constitutional control. A secret mechanism where data is mined to control a community without accountability." Then he laughed, shaking his head slightly. "I was just kidding. Don't make this into a sensational headline." 3 days later, he abruptly resigned and disappeared. Renata searched for clues at the last place Nolan had been seen, a modest apartment in suburban Detroit. The landlord said he had left in the middle of the night, leaving behind all his belongings, taking only his personal computer. The police had registered the case, but not opened a missing persons case because there was no evidence of a crime. She stood in the middle of his old room, the sunlight slanting through the dusty curtains, making faint streaks on the wooden floor. That's when she spotted a small piece of paper tucked behind an upside-down picture frame on a shelf. On it, there was only one handwritten line: "If I never come back, find Celeste Hill. Same address, 3rd floor." The name Celeste Hill made Renata shiver, not because it was famous, but because it had never been mentioned in any internal reports she had ever read. It was all hearsay. A former FBI analyst had written a report on Tier 12's target identification discrepancies and was forced to retire shortly after. Renata drove through the night, almost 400 miles, with nothing more than a cold bottle of coffee and a dull ache in her back. The 3rd floor of the old motel was now a convenience store, but she noticed something unusual. On the dusty glass door were 3 very small letters, CH, sealed with clear tape. She knocked. No one answered. But at exactly 200 that afternoon, a woman in her 50s with silver hair walked out of the store. Without saying a word, she just glanced at Renata and silently gestured for her to follow. Before she left, Celeste said one last thing: "If you make these documents public, they will not only destroy your career, they will go back into your past, turn over every page, every little mistake, and push you down the rabbit hole with the very thing you once believed in the law." Renata replied softly, her voice firm. "If we stay silent, the law is no longer the law. It is just an empty shell. And I will not spend my life defending a shell. Back home." Renata copied the entire file onto 3 encrypted hard drives. One was mailed to a respected independent journalist. One was hidden in a hidden drawer in an old law office. The other, she kept it with her. The feeling was no longer fear, but a kind of calm before the storm. She stood in the middle of her small kitchen, holding a cold cup of herbal tea. On the table was a photo of her husband, the man who always said, "You don't have to make the world right. You just have to do your part." Renata smiled and began to compose a final email to all her former students, former colleagues, law professors, people who had believed in the cause. The subject line: "I am about to do the most dangerous and right thing of my life." Since that morning when the top secret report had been delivered, everything in Renata Vaughn's Renata's life had changed forever. No sirens, no knocks on the door. But the silence was the clearest sign of the storm brewing. A computer that slowed down unexpectedly, an email that failed to send a strange car parked across the street for 3 hours. No one smoking, no movement. And then her phone was disabled. Renata knew they had found out. The next morning, she was sitting in the old cafeteria that had once been a student meeting place when 4 men in plain clothes walked in, no badges, no IDs. One put a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "Mrs. Vaughn, please come with us. We have some questions to answer." "Where are your orders?" she asked. "No orders if it's just a chat." The other smiled coldly. A regular in the bar stood up trying to take a video, but was pushed away gently and professionally. There was no fighting, no screaming, just complete control. Renata was taken into a black SUV, no license plate, and they didn't go to the police station. She was taken to an abandoned building inside a room that looked like a makeshift office. A woman walked in, wearing a blue shirt, her voice soft and cold. "We know you're smart, so we're not going to consider you a criminal, just someone who doesn't understand the whole picture." Renata looked her straight in the eye. "And who are you in the big picture?" She laughed, flipped open a laptop and played back the video of Renata handing the hard drive to her former lawyer and the image of the hard drive being sent to the journalist. They had been watching her since before, not when she sent the documents, long before. "You're a good person, but you're playing with something you don't understand. That system, Tier 12, isn't there to oppress people of color, as you think. It's a safety net. It's why you've been able to sleep through 30 years as a prosecutor. They keep track of everything, so we don't have to do the dirty work." Renata laughed dryly. "Not doing the dirty work. So monitoring a teenager because he listens to protest music is clean. Locking someone up because an algorithm says face prone to rebellion is right." The woman sighed. "You wouldn't understand. But I'm giving you a choice. Take it all back. Write a statement saying you've been misunderstood, and we'll leave you alone. Or we'll let your past speak for itself." Renata knew that if she signed that paper it would be over, the truth would be buried, and people like Nolan Reese would forever be lost lunatics. But if she didn't sign, they would reopen old cases, prosecutions she thought were justified, and use that past to destroy her. She chose not to sign. After more than 5 hours of psychological interrogation, they released her. No orders, no apologies. But an hour later, a message from her journalist friend said her report couldn't be published. His server had been hacked. The newsroom had received a reminder from the higher-ups. They were silencing everyone. Renata immediately switched to a backup plan, live streaming. That night, she turned on the camera. The only thing on the live stream was a soft yellow light, a wall with a map and a clipboard behind it, and Renata Vaughn's unflinching face. "I'm a former federal prosecutor. I used to believe in justice. I believed in data. But now I'm telling you, there's a system called Tier 12 designed to score people like a credit score. Your data is being extracted, decrypted, used as evidence, even if you don't go to court. I have evidence. And I'm going to make it public because if I don't, I'm complicit." More than 40,000 people tuned in after 10 minutes, nearly 100,000 after half an hour. And then the screen went black. The signal went dead. Renata knew it. They had tampered with the network. She pulled the memory card out of the camera and ran to her car, carrying only 3 things: the encrypted laptop, the original file, and the federal document identification stamp, proof that Tier 12 was an official program. The car behind her immediately followed. No sirens, no lights. Just a covert pursuit. Renata turned left, then right, around the freeway, and into the old hospital parking garage. There she switched cars with an old friend who was waiting. The plan was set. By dawn, Renata was in a small cabin in the woods of Vermont. No cell service, no internet. But inside was an old printer enough to copy and distribute documents to independent networks, citizen groups, research institutes. No more media. We don't need the news system to tell the truth. We just need persistence and a community that is no longer afraid. Renata Vaughn, once a model prosecutor, is now the target of a global surveillance program. But she is not alone. People who have been tracked by Tier 12 are speaking out. Former FBI agents who were wrongfully fired are rewriting their profiles. A fire has begun to burn. And Renata is the one who ignites it. Some nights I think the truth is a lamp. But the longer I live, the more I realize the truth can also be a fire. And if you're not careful, you'll be the one to burn it. Renata Vaughn. Personal note. The cabin in the woods that Renata has been hiding in for the past 2 weeks seems to have been forgotten by the world. No phone signal, no internet. Every morning, there's only the sound of the wind blowing through the oak trees and the lonely calls of birds from the edge of the valley. That morning, however, a car stopped a few hundred meters away. The engine wasn't very powerful. It seemed to be a civilian vehicle. But to Renata, anyone coming to this place was an anomaly. Her hand lightly touched the USB drive containing a copy of the Tier 12 dossier, then quickly hid it in the bottom of her carefully sewn cloth bag. When she opened the door, it wasn't an agent. It wasn't a reporter. It was Sasha, her only granddaughter, Sasha. The girl with the same brown eyes as her sister stood there shivering, not from the cold, but from fear. She held a dead phone in her hand, and her lips trembled when she saw Renata. "Auntie, they came to find me. They asked about you. They threatened to check my mother's bank account, freeze my scholarship to study abroad," they said. "If I didn't cooperate, everything would disappear like it had never existed." Renata was silent. A chill spread from her chest to her palms. "I didn't say anything, I ran away. I followed the address you left in the spare letter, but..." "Why, Auntie? Why are they treating you like a criminal?" Renata pulled Sasha into her arms. For the first time in her life, the only person left in her family was caught in the vortex she had set in motion. She knew this day would come, but not now. Not when Sasha was only 21, about to graduate from law school, and had never been hurt by anything beyond the reach of books. That same evening, Renata received a message. Not by email, not by phone, but by the voice on the old radio in the cabin. "Mrs. Vaughn, do you understand now? There are no exceptions. We don't need to arrest you. We just need to touch the people you love, and you'll do the rest." Renata trembled. Not from fear, but from the perfect cruelty. The blow didn't require a knife, just a gentle suggestion that Sasha's life, her future, her dream of becoming a human rights lawyer, could be erased with the push of a button. Sasha didn't know the truth, but she knew enough to know that her aunt wasn't a bad person, and with watery eyes, she asked softly, "If I begged, would you stop?" The question was like a knife cutting into Renata's chest. She turned away, unable to face that gaze. "If I knew the truth, I would never ask you to stop. But if you continue, I will pay the price with you. And that is something you cannot allow." Sasha took her hand. "You raised me like your own daughter. After my mother died, you were the first person to believe that I could become a lawyer. Now let me repay you with the opposite belief. If you believe that the truth is worth the sacrifice, then I will not ask you to stop. I will ask to continue walking with you." That night, Renata did not sleep. She sat watching the flickering oil lamp, writing a long letter by hand, hiding it under the wooden floor. Inside were Sasha's instructions for how to continue this journey safely. If no one else could lead the way, who to contact, where to send the files, what to analyze, and most importantly, how to survive. She knew what was coming. Not a public manhunt, a car accident, a disappearance, a staged suicide. Or worse, a death that no one noticed, with the public distracted by other news. And if that happened, she had to let Sasha live. Early the next morning, she woke Sasha and handed her a train ticket out of Vermont to another safe house in Maine, a former retreat for a retired judge. I love you, and if you really want to help me, you'll have to leave today. I don't want to leave you. If you stay, they won't catch you, but they'll destroy you from the inside by making you doubt yourself, your aunt, and the ideals you once held. Sasha's eyes filled with tears, but she knew. Her promise to protect the truth now meant protecting life. When Renata returned to the cabin, she began to act as if this were her last day. She made 12 copies of the entire document, put them in 12 packages, and sent them to 12 secret addresses. Each place was a starting point for the story, a clue that an impartial observer could follow. Finally, she reset her computer, setting it to auto-broadcast. If her heart stopped, a video would automatically be live-streamed online with all the data. If they killed her, they couldn't kill the truth. 3 days later, they came. Not in black, not with guns, but the armored car and the signal jammer were a clear statement. No one was allowed to know what was going on here. Renata stepped out, her silver hair flying in the wind, carrying only the USB drive containing the final code. She smiled and said, "I didn't come here to run away. I came here to die for what I believe is the truth." And as the car door closed, she was no longer afraid, because she knew whatever happened to her, her beloved granddaughter, would continue the journey. They can arrest a man, but they can't arrest an awakened conscience, and when conscience spreads, it becomes fire. Renata Vaughn's last words recorded 12 hours before her disappearance. The mainstream news said nothing. There was no news report that former federal prosecutor Renata Vaughn is missing. No FBI alert, no photos, no cameras. Only those involved knew she had been taken. No trial, no charges, no explanation. Just a 64-year-old woman who had held hundreds of high-profile criminal trials just disappeared. They thought if they caught Renata, it would all be over. What they didn't know, Renata had sent out 12 files, and one of those files was made public, not by a journalist, not by a hacker, but by a law student named Sasha. Sasha has nothing, just a young girl with a belief that justice is real, but thanks to instructions in a handwritten letter from her aunt, she approaches a group of former NSA employees who were fired for questioning Tier 12s. She brings the file saying, "My aunt sacrificed her life to bring this truth to light. If I do nothing, her death will be just a blur in history." At first, they are skeptical, but when they see Renata's cryptographic signature compared to the actual data string, they know this file is real, and beyond imagination, Tier 12, it turns out, is a machine learning-based citizen classification system that combines data from sources, hospital records, phone locations, bank transactions, social media histories, and a social resistance index, a secret measure developed by a team within the Department of Homeland Security. Anyone who scores above 7.2 is placed on a potentially unstable list, subject to surveillance, job denial, random accidents, or, like Renata removal. Renata Vaughn was not returned. She did not appear at any of the hearings. No one knows if she is alive or dead. But at an informal memorial service held in a Boston square, more than 25,000 people stood in the rain, each holding a white daisy, the flower she loved to grow when she was young. I became a lawyer because my aunt believed that justice did not need power to exist. Sasha Vaughn, speaking at the memorial service, Sasha went on to earn a doctorate in law, become a civil rights expert, and one of the living witnesses of the Tier 12 event. And on the small bookshelf in the living room, she kept a single framed photo of her aunt smiling, standing in a garden of white daisies. She told everyone, "I'm not sure I have the courage that my aunt has, but I'm sure of one thing: I will not let the world go back to its silent sleep." So after all that has happened, the disappearance, the return, and the exposure, the name Renata Vaughn is no longer just a woman's name. It has become a symbol of courage, of steadfastness, in the face of a cold, unfeeling system of power willing to sacrifice a human being just to protect a heartless algorithm. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, how is it that an American citizen, once honored, once dedicated to service, could be labeled a security risk by the system simply because she dared to ask questions that no one else wanted to answer. How is it that a program like Tier 12, funded by billions of taxpayer dollars, can track, classify, and silently eliminate the bravest people in the dark, without any of us ever having the right to say yes or no? This is not just Renata Vaughn's story. This is a wake-up call for all of us. Because if someone like her, with her title, with her credentials, with her reputation, can be dragged into that forced silence, then you, me, all of us could be next. We live in a world where the truth can be marked as a threat, and where silence is rewarded, and speaking up can cost you your career, your reputation, even your personal safety. Are you okay with that? If the answer is no, then don't let this story stop at a video you watched. Let it be a conversation you start, an action you take, an awakening you spread. Leave a comment below. For Renata, for people like her, and for yourself, to prove that there are people who care, who listen, who dare to fight back. Like, if you feel the injustice in this story is outrageous, if you feel like you can't sit still when the truth is distorted and people are buried by the system, and if you want to continue accompanying the brave stories, exposing lies, raising the value of truth, click subscribe to the channel now, because we will be back with other truths, hidden stories, people who need your voice to be seen. Don't be silent. Don't turn away. Don't let Renata Vaughn be the last victim. Be the one to start the change. We believe in you, and we hope you believe in yourselves.